Natalia Goncharova, the firebird of Russian avant-garde. Perhaps we shall allow her friends to introduce her. Tall, elongated, like a Byzantine icon, Natalia Sergeyevna Goncharova, Talinka, along with an outstanding talent as an artist, possessed most profound views in life and in art. And another, Goncharova, her name sounded like victory. This was a characteristic by Marina Tsvetaeva, a famous Russian poetess, whose father, professor of the Moscow University, was one of the founders of the Pushkin Fine Arts Museums in Moscow. In this talk, we shall discuss what made Natalia Goncharova stand out amid other avant-garde artists. Her oeuvre shall be considered as offering a unique amalgamation of Impressionism, Fauvism, Futurism, Rayonism, Neo-Primitivism, folk crafts, popular prints, religious painting, constructivism, and early Italian painting and mosaics, Spanish scenery and mystery plays, among other influences. We shall show how Natalia Goncharova's integrity and industry served to give credibility to the nascent new art and establish herself as an ambassador of Russian artistic achievement outside Russia. We shall conclude that, having studied and experimented with the major artistic vocabularies of late 19th, early 20th century of the then capital of the arts, France, Natalia Goncharova discovered a fresh inspiration in the indigenous tradition and elaborated a highly personal style at the confluence of contemporary European and enduring national artistic expressions. Self-portrait with yellow lilies. This is a programmatic portrait. Natalia represents herself as a professional artist, with canvases in the background indicative of her profession, with bright flowers and an open gaze, the paintings behind her, in the most contemporary of artistic vocabularies, as a manifesto of someone who lives in the present and looks to the future. Of aristocratic descent, she represents herself as a lady who intends to work for a living, with strong hands and a simple dress. Gift and work, work and gift, the gift of work. This was another characteristic given to her by Marina Tsvetaeva. They were close friends both in Moscow and in Paris, where they lived after the revolution. In 1881, Natalia was born in Tula region into a family of a famous Moscow architect and his wife, a daughter of a professor of the Moscow Theological Academy. She was also a descendant of the noble Goncharov family, whose Natalia Goncharova, the artist's namesake, was the celebrated first beauty of the day in early 19th century and wife of the poet Alexander Pushkin. When Natalia was about 10 years old, the family moved to Moscow. And in 1901, Natalia joins the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture and Architecture, Moscow's preeminent art school, initially to train as a sculptor. In 1913, in Moscow, she showed her works at her solo exhibition, the first public one-woman show in Russia, where she presented over 700 works, and in 1914 in St. Petersburg, with few works. She showed pieces produced between 1900 and 1913. These are some of the most important dates from Natalia Goncharova's life, and the exhibition of 1913 we shall discuss later, but this was one of the most important events, both in her personal life, her life as an artist, and the life of the nascent avant-garde, because it helped to turn the tide of public opinion and forge an acceptance of this new art form. Perhaps it's necessary to say a few words about why it was Moscow that became the hub of new artistic activity. In the 1880s, and until the outbreak of the First World War, Muscovite representatives of the new class of bourgeoisie started collecting the newest French painting, pioneering collectors collecting pioneering art, before it was even recognized in the artist's own country. By opening their collections to the public, and certainly to art students, the patrons were strongly influencing the evolution of artistic expression in Russia. The same bourgeoisie ignited another dramatic departure, Being deeply religious, they possessed traditional devotional images, the icons, and exhibitions of the icons, initially intended for private devotion, proved incendiary for the imagination of the artists, further stoking an interest in popular artistic aesthetic. These inspirations combined formed the neo-primitivism, new naive art, a definitive aesthetic of avant-garde, in particular Natalia Goncharova's. This work, Peasant Women with Rakes, was produced in 1907. In the early days of her career, Natalia Goncharova was very interested in Paul Gauguin's work and sought to study the master's style. Crucially, Natalia spent her early years in the countryside, where she could observe the life of the peasants, and where she developed a profound love of the country and adoration of the life of the village as she observed it. Expressive, energetic, and dramatic manner is what we observe in this painting, a combination of the latest artistic trends with folklore and themes of peasant life, but with their monumentality and stylization, offering a contemplation on the universal laws of creation. Pictorially, this painting is a departure from the classical tradition in its dispensing with a linear perspective, its near two-dimensionality, its evocation of rustic, rough-hewn aesthetics, the use of simple color, and in its decorativism, conjuring broadly conceived ethnic motives from diverse temporalities and geographies, in another allusion to the universality of laws of nature and human existence. A primordial way of existence as an antidote to academism. For Russian painting, this was a rediscovery of folk culture, indigenous folk culture, and it proved natural for Goncharova. Moreover, folk expression will prove the definitive characteristic of her work and a key element of her idiosyncrasy. Natalia Goncharova Gardening, 1908. By 1908, there will be Picasso's work in the collections of Muscovite art patrons, and his early Cubism was another influence. In her work, Natalia Goncharova was not trying to imitate all those new currents, but she really was interested in trying to get to the core of these new vocabularies. So she would spend about half a year, several months, trying to master this new aesthetic, this new style, as one would follow another, to be able to form her own repertoire of different styles, to be able to fuse them later, to express her own vision. The key iconographic and stylistic influence was the medium of lobok. Lobok is a popular print. Early examples from the late 17th and early 18th century were woodcuts, followed by engravings or etchings, and from mid-19th century, lithography. Some of the most popular were prints featuring religious subjects, illustrations of folk tales, and in times of war, patriotic and satirical themes. These are some examples of what lobok or popular prints represented. Many of them were subsequently colored by hand-colored. And that was another one of the influx of this primitive art that was so enduring to artists that were reared on, of course, academic tradition, but were finding it already wanting. New times demanded a new vocabulary. And in turning to their own folk culture, they were finding new, refreshing currents. In many ways, it was a heroic endeavor, because following the reforms of Peter I, and for 200 years after those reforms, folk culture, including religious expression, were considered not only second best, but somewhat best forgotten, best not mentioned. They were hugely despised and looked upon as the dark ages of Russian artistic expression. So when these artists started to deliberately explore it, it was almost a rehabilitating national and indigenous culture. It was different from, for instance, Gauguin or Picasso, who were traveling to Tahiti or to Africa. It was one thing to be a traveler, discovering exotic cultures, and another to try and rehabilitate something indigenous and hitherto despised. Natalia Goncharova was present at an excavation site in 1910, where she was able to observe the recovery of ancient artifacts, at the time broadly termed Scythian, and to see magnificent stone sculptures in situ in the majestic expanses of the steppe. She may have been exposed to these sculptures in museum contexts, but to be able to observe them in the infinite majesty of the landscape, and this infinity combined with the majesty of stonework, this would have had a completely different impression on an artist's imagination. Stone baba, or babas in the plural, are anthropomorphic stone sculptures discovered in significant numbers in the steppe regions of Russia and South Siberia in particular. In the early 20th century, the development of archaeological research, desire for a reconstruction of historicity, and interest in the ancient or past in connection with definitions of national identity rendered the broadly and romantically interpreted Scythian theme prominent, even highly influential, in artistic, philosophical, and literary reflection and expression. During the excavations observed by Goncharova, she and the artists who were there at the same time were primarily interested not in the refined items subsequently known as the gold of the Scythian, but the unpolished artifacts, as more faithfully descriptive of the indigenous culture than the articles of gold and precious stones. Yes, nothing prepared us for this image. Pillars of Salt produced in the same year, while the impressions were still fresh in the mind of the artist. Here we observe a combination of the secular and sacral in the artist's aesthetic practice. Frequently, such statues were considered to be goddesses of fertility, and to the left, we can see a figure with a child in her lap, also evocative of the images of the Virgin and the Child. At this stage, Goncharova was also familiar with Picasso's work and the inspiration he drew from African sculpture and African indigenous expression. The next painting we shall look at is called Round Dance, produced in the same year. This painting belongs to the period of everything-ism, a term coined by one of the poet artists of the period and embraced by Goncharova. In this work, illustrative of Goncharova's approach to painting generally, a multitude of sources are fused together to produce an idiosyncratic style. Gauguin, Cézanne, Fauvism, Neo-Primitivism, Expressionism, the monumentality of sculpture, the facial expression inspired by ancient plastic arts from various cultures, and the gravity of timelessness. We shall not forget that Goncharova started to train as a sculptor, and she continued this practice at least for the next 5 or 6 years. She even fetched awards at exhibitions of sculpture where she presented her work. The artist achieved a strong expressive power through the solemn monumentality in the rendering of the figures and an intense decorative effect through the vibrancy of the colors. Peasant women, or babe. Babe is the plural of baba, the term used to signify the ancient stone sculptures found in the steppes. The artist herself defined the sources of such works as the Scythian stone images and painted wooden dolls sold at fairs. She did not so much stylize or imitate as borrow the very specifics of folk creativity, its impersonal power, monumentality, and bewitching sacral profundity. Peasants picking apples, produced a year later. The artist herself defined the sources of such works, again as his Scythian stone images and painted wooden dolls sold at fairs. I think I decided to repeat this caption because somehow these works resemble each other, and also to draw one's attention to Picasso's inspiration. And we shall look at it in the next slide. The farm woman and the farm woman bust, they were also in the Muscovite collections, and they are farming women, and the inspiration is derived from African sculpture. And yet again, if we remind ourselves as the sculptural sensibilities of Natalia Goncharova, and if we look back to this image, and also think about the painted wooden dolls that would have been executed rather roughly, the faces of these images, they bring together the aesthetic of African sculpture, of these wooden dolls, and the Scythian stone images. Even the apples look as if they were made out of stone, as if they were not stone or wooden sculpture. Washing linen. By 1910, Larionov, who was a close associate and one of the agents provocateurs of the Muscovite avant-garde scene, had formulated and Goncharova implemented the principle of neo-primitivism, whereby art should be actual, contemporary in language, but should draw upon indigenous sources, which could be as profound as desired. Such sources included icons, popular prints, discussed earlier, wooden toys, painted trays, embroideries, shawls, textiles, any folk endeavor. In this particular painting, color is employed as a major means of expression. Bold combinations of colors and their brightness will continue to define Goncharova's work, as well as the fluidity of aesthetics, also evidenced here, similarly to the previous painting, and the principal characteristic of the artist's gift and working method. If we look at the fields, well, they look as if they could be fields or indeed linen lined up in the background. We might wonder from where this particular iconography is derived. And here is an answer to this. This is Vincent van Gogh and Landscape at Auvergne after rain. This painting was also in the Muscovite collection, now in the Pushkin Fine Arts Museum. And I think the motive, which was appropriated and reworked, of the fields in Auvergne after rain, and the fields where the peasants were laying out their linen to dry after it was washed, becomes quite obvious. And another painting by Vincent van Gogh, the Red Vineyards, furnishes us with some clues as to the shapes of the peasants, their angularity, and again certain monumentality and statuesque forms. Both here and in the previous painting, we can see reminiscences of these shapes. And yet again, Van Gogh's landscape at Auvergne, in the fields in the background of this painting, where the peasants are now washing their horses. And in this painting, we shall see a confluence of those various aesthetics to which Goncharova was exposed and which she was trying to explore in her own work, then fuse it in various pieces. So there's some of the cubism and fauvism and expressionism, and some of the indigenous peasant aesthetic as well. Winter collecting fireworks. The artist was blurring categorical distinctions between the various trends in contemporary painting. As a result, her work is characterized by syncretism, a synergy of stylistic approaches situated within a framework of diverse antiquities, a paleo-avant-garde. This seems to be a contradiction in terms, and yet this is what came to define Goncharova's style. Peacock Russian embroidery style, as we observed earlier, one of the inspirations was embroidery, and the peacock is a reminiscence and allusion to the Byzantine artistic expression because in the Byzantine iconography, peacocks were symbols of longevity. And in some ways, that also is a ramification or a conversation with the Russian firebird, because in the Russian folklore, firebirds were looked upon as symbols of eternal youth, of joy, of happiness, of longevity. And here is a confluence of these two motives, Byzantine and folk Russian, and another peacock in bright sunshine, Egyptian style. This was part of a series of artistic possibilities on the matter of the peacock. And the energy and the dynamism and the certain unbridled energy of the colors were what will define Goncharova's work, and it also contributes to our understanding of the title of the talk, why she was called and referred to as the firebird of Russian avant-garde. The Evangelists, 1911. In her religious pieces, Natalia Goncharova drew upon diverse sources, as is typical of all her work. Sources here included the Holy Scriptures, old icons, and all believers' woodcuts, representing the complex theme of the apocalypse. And early Christian expression, probably Coptic art, and early Byzantine frescoes and mosaics. The Evangelists is considered one of her most remarkable works. The enormous figures, set against a black background, are full of an extraordinary inner strength, which she sought and admired in the broadly conceived antiquity. Inner strength for Goncharova was concluded in the folk and in the sacral, which she hardly separated, and in rootedness, in the wholeness. Phoenix. This is one of the pieces which constituted the Harvest series. The series contained 9 pieces, and it was a visualization of the complex yet again theme of the apocalypse. Of the 9, 7 survive. Sorry, just a sip of water. And here again is the colors, particularly the brightness of colors and the two-dimensionality, which will characterize her later expression, and how she was taking up a diverse array of graphic arts, which also, as we will see and have already seen, were informed to a large extent by plastic arts. If we look here, this is a photograph of a Goncharova exhibition in Palazzo Strozzi in Florence, held in 2019, where they were able to bring together 5 of the survival 7 pieces. And the Phoenix, which you have just considered, is in the top left-hand corner. Also, on the right, we shall see, or we can see, the painting Gardening, which we also saw a few minutes ago. Perhaps unexpectedly, Natalia Goncharova presented very many religious paintings. And again, it is somewhat controversial, it would seem, in a discourse on avant-garde. Avant-garde is something which is supposed to be departing from tradition, and in many ways it was, except Russian avant-garde, especially for Goncharova, was informed by Russian indigenous past, as we already discussed. And well, paradoxically, for an avant-garde artist, Natalia Goncharova was deeply interested in religious imagery, and ultimately, far from contradicting her avant-garde sensibilities, this interest played an integral and prominent role in her career, as well as being part of a broader movement in Russia to engage contemporary aesthetics in ecclesiastical contexts. She will eventually be accepted in this aspect of her art, but initially it was particularly religious pieces that were raising the eyebrows, and even on occasion religious paintings were removed from her exhibitions. And yet later they came to define much of her personal art and also the art of the period. And to understand the iconographical sources for this particular expression, of this particular piece, we shall possibly look at this image here. This triptych with Christ in Majesty and the apostles either side of him is inspired by a traditional Russian iconostasis, where this would be part of the register, which was called Iesous, which represented Christ in Majesty or Christ enthroned. And in this particular case, there are apostles interceding on behalf of the humankind. And yet again, it was a very established iconographically register called Iesous and very typical in the Russian iconostasis. This was a prototype for the triptych which we saw earlier. In other religious painting, the Mother of God with ornamental border. This is again a combination of the various inspirations that were nurturing Natalia Goncharova's art. This would be religious expression and also the folk decorativism. Yet again, she hardly decorated folk and religious, and indeed, starting from the 1700s and essentially until the 1900s, this was the official confluence of ideas. Folk expression was interpreted or understood as combining both decorative and, in fact, religious, because religious expression was almost banned from official artistic discourse, at least as it was practiced up until the end of the 17th century in its canonical form, inspired by Byzantine canonical art. And another one, Saint Barbara, the great martyr, and that was inspired by Lubbock, a folk wood print, and Natalia Goncharova in this work also arranged the scenes from Saint Barbara's life in a cruciform arrangement, filling the corners with folk on decorative designs. And another inspiration was the crowning of the Mother of God, tripartite composition. But this was also drawn from Lubbock, but that particular Lubbock would have been inspired by West European engravings and probably El Greco's work. And if we look at the bottom of this piece, we shall see archangels or cherubs with the various Spanish facial expressions, which also points to El Greco. And El Greco was painted was trained as an icon painter originally, and also parts of this composition represents already familiar folk decorative motifs. It's also important to say how Natalia Goncharova was a definitive influence in the history of Russian avant-garde, because even though she was very prolific, and even though she was very industrious and an earnest artist who was also studying the entire history of art, it's possibly not sufficient to be able to produce artwork. It's very important to bring it to the public. And this is when we must look at Mikhail Fyodorovich Larionov. Larionov was Natalia Goncharova's lifelong friend and artistic partner. Eventually, they became married in 1955 when they were in their 70s. But at this early stage in their careers, Mikhail Larionov was this proactive force that united around his person and that of Goncharova all the artists who sought to express themselves in this new aesthetic, in the one that was breaking away from traditional 19th century and traditional academic painting. Naval Diamonds, also known as the Jack of Diamonds, was both the name of the 1910-1911 art exhibition held in Moscow and the artist association that existed in the wake of that exhibition from 1911 to 1917. and united under its banner a cohort of rebels against the academic canons and seekers for new vocabularies in art. The name was coined by Mikhail Larionov, although others also claimed the authorship to the name of this first Avant-Garde exhibition. He was one of the principal organizers of the group's first show and of a number of subsequent initiatives to promote and establish the new art. Goncharova and Larionov remained at the head of the group during 1910-1911, but left subsequently. So the Naval Diamonds. The goals of this exhibition were to unite all forces who disagreed with academic and realist art of the 19th century, to provoke the establishment and to attract attention. Elia Marshkov's painting, self-portrait and the portrait of Peter or Pyotr Konchalovsky, presented at this exhibition, was of course one of the most shocking pieces. It represents, well, the artist, but not what it could come across as in today's terms. At the time, being an athlete was very much de rigueur. It was extremely fashionable. Also, cinematography was very fresh and new and very much in vogue, but there was no sound in the cinema at the time. So it had to be accompanied live. And normally the accompaniment was by piano. On the piano, on the shelf above the piano, there are books, and the books are, one of the volumes is called The Arts, the one next to it is Greek, Egypt, Italy, and the next is the Bible. Interestingly, the Bible was interpreted as a source, both as art historical source and a source for the imagery as artistic inspiration. So this group did look to the past. And yet again, it's a new testimony to the very interesting fusion, and which would seem to be an oxymoron and a contradiction in terms of the art that was trying to overthrow the traditional pillars of artistic expression. And at the same time, they looked for inspiration in the unadulterated art of the ages gone by. They interpreted it as something that was not obscured by the contrivances of later academic formulae. In some way, parallels could be drawn with pre-Raphaelite arts. They possibly were not looking to the same foundations, but the idea was similar, if not the same. They were trying to rediscover art in its pure form. And above the artists, we see two still life. Initially, as the story goes, these were supposed to be the portraits of the artists' respective wives, but the wives disagreed to be represented in this particular context. And that was when the portraits were painted over and turned into still life. So this painting, in a way, encapsulates those goals. So it was supposed to be very new and provocative, and provocation is a very old method of attracting attention. And Larionov and Goncharova left the group, disagreeing with the members' wholesale adulation of Cézanne and Westernism, understood as contemporary French painting. They founded a new organization with a name to promote quintessentially Russian artistic expression, not least in the neo-primitivist aesthetic, with roots in the Lobok, indigenous folk arts, and devotional arts. So many of the paintings which we saw before were represented at this initial statement, this Nave of Diamonds exhibition. The name of the exhibition was provocative in itself, with multiple connotations, one of them addressing to the prisoners who were having some diamonds sewn onto their robes, and many other provocative connotations as well. But at the time, it was simply necessary to unite everyone, all the forces, very disparate forces who sought for this new expression, for them to be able to make this statement, because individually they wouldn't have been able to achieve this. And also Larionov was very good at provoking publicity. He was stirring mainstream newspapers, and there were reviews published on the front pages of the very established newspapers. And that was a very interesting period in artistic expression in Russia, and particularly Moscow at the time, because the public were genuinely interested in art discourse, and front pages of those established newspapers were in fact given over to artistic debates. And right, in 2012, Larionov, Goncharova, and the like-minded artists organized a new exhibition, Donkey's Tale, shown at the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture and Architecture, where alongside Larionov and Goncharova exhibited Malevich, Tatlin, Chagall, and others, 18 artists in total. Donkey's Tale also has a story. In 1910, in France, there was an exhibition at the Salon des Indépendants, and there was a group of pranksters who exhibited a painting which they claimed had been exhibited by an actual donkey's tail. Whether it was to mock the new artistic expression or in solidarity is hard to tell, but when that story reached Moscow, and it reached it right away, it gained the hearts of these new mischievous artists, and it was used for this subversive exhibition. They were not only just exhibiting their work, they were also trying to bring their aesthetic to the broader public in many different ways. One of them was a precursor of body art. They were painting their faces in futurist makeup. This is what it was called. And this was a journal article with a manifesto of the group, or manifesto of the futurists. And futurism was somewhat different from the Italian futurists. The term avant-garde did not exist at the time, but all the art that sought to look to the future in Moscow was called futurism. And that particular manifesto was called Why We Paint Ourselves. And what they sought to say was when one exits the house every day in the morning, one meets different passers-by, one encounters very many different events. They may be pushed by someone, or they may see a novelty all the time, a trolley bus, and every different encounter, every different event will leave in trace in the psyche of the person. And they externalized these encounters and these internal traces through the medium of this makeup. They did not only publish manifestos, but they also organized events or actions. For instance, Larionov, as the major agent of publicity, he was sending announcements to mainstream newspapers with the time and the date where the futurists would arrive with their faces painted, and the promenade, arrange a promenade, and then also paint the faces of everyone who would like to have their faces painted. So at the appointed time and date, by the time the futurists would arrive in a limousine and alight from the car, the press would be there, and they would be met by this vast array of representatives of newspapers, and the next day there will be reports everywhere, as well as, interestingly, a great array of interested persons. And these actions were a great success. So many would offer themselves to have their faces painted, which of course would ultimately draw attention to the paintings and to their exhibitions. This was another account of such facial body art actions. This was a photograph from the journal Lights, Futurist Makeup, and the caption says, the artist Natalia Goncharova is painting the physiognomy of poet Bolshakov before his promenade in Kuznetsky Most. Kuznetsky Most, or Kuznetsky Bridge, was the most fashionable place in Moscow, lined with fashionable boutiques, and the place to which I personally have a connection through ancestral connections. And so the other caption here says, the head of Moscow Futurists, artist Larionov, was painting in inverted commas on his face. As you can see, not only the artistic community, but the wider public were made widely aware of this new group and of their multifarious exploits. This is a group of artists, Larionov to the left, Romanovich, who is somewhat lesser known, Obolensky, Natalia Goncharova, Fabry, Shevchenko, at the exhibition of Donkey's Tale in 1913. In the central background and to the right are pieces by Larionov himself and Natalia Goncharova amid this array of artists. If we go back just one slide, we shall see that, as a matter of fact, these artists, these troublemakers, who were so full of mischief and joie de vivre, looked extremely decent. And it was not only a facade. They were absolutely divorced from what can be assumed as some kind of depraved bohemian lifestyle. They were broadly educated. They were extremely serious about their art. They were studying it, both contemporary art and, as we have seen, these thick folios of the whole history of art expression. They were very erudite, and they were not always very rich, clearly, although Natalia Goncharova didn't have a financial problem because she was a daughter of a widely recognized architect. But it was not only a decent facade, as I'm saying, they were really persons of integrity, and particularly Natalia Goncharova. Even though it was, a slightly controversial image because of aristocratic descent and related through this tradition to the poet Pushkin himself. And a lady artist, a professional artist, that was still unusual, who was in a long-standing relationship with Larionov, and they were not married. So, of course, on the one hand, that did attract attention in its own right. Yet, not anyone, not ever, said a word of gossip about Natalia Goncharova. She was widely renowned as an icon of personal integrity. And even though there were now two warring fractions in the Muscovite world of avant-garde, one led by Larionov, who were preaching neo-primitivism and indigenous sources and indigenous inspiration, and the other, who were enamored of contemporary French expression, Cézanne, Gauguin, and the like, and the Fauvism. And they were holding bitter debates, specially organized debates, to which the public were invited. And sometimes the ultimate argument was a jug full of water thrown into the audience. Not ever, and there were possibly bitter personal remarks exchanged. Not anyone, not once, mentioned Natalia Goncharova in any unpleasant or controversial context. She was widely respected by everyone, and not least her personal integrity helped to forge the reputation of this new art. Because when in 1913, she held this enormous exhibition with over 700 pieces, she helped to cement this reputation because it was positively critiqued, possibly for the first time, by the newspapers and by the art critics in their specialized reviews. Not only was it positive, but again, it helped to turn the tide of public opinion. which is why, yet again, we must celebrate Natalia Goncharova, and which also, going back to the title of our talk, The Firebird of Russian Avant-Garde. She was not only one of the first women artists, she was not the only one. She was one who was a public face of avant-garde and the public integrity and industry as well. Natalia Goncharova, cyclist. This was yet another aesthetic, and this was futurism. Futurism in Russia also was understood as connected to movement and dynamism in terms of the new vehicles of the time, the electricity, velocity, and the new speed yet again. Because this period in human development as well saw major technological breakthroughs, and they sought to convey it, to forge this particular meaning in their art, in pictorial art. It was easy to see how the very traditional 19th century academic painting already was somewhat not sufficient to convey all these new developments, this new temporality in this new artistic discourse. So what we see here is this movement. So the cyclist is moving, and the different silhouettes of the wheels of this cyclist are intended to show the speed, and not only of this particular cyclist, but also of the age. And the telegraph as well, this was almost from the realm of fantasy, and the telephone, and that people could send telegrams as well. It was all very stirring and very incendiary to the imaginations of the artists. And in Russia, futurism was a fusion of pictorial and literary aesthetics, very much like the realism of the 19th century. So it was now the same idea, but shown, conveyed through new artistic means. And when we look at these words behind, in the background, one can simply imagine how the cyclist is flashing by the various boutiques, various shops. One says silk, the other one says hats, which is haberdashery. And T is the first for telephone, and a signpost with this pointing finger. So he's flashing by the city landscape. And that was one of the pieces, again, of this new aesthetic, which was futurism, and another testimony to Goncharova's versatility and various aspects, multifarious expression. He was very interested in all of this, and yet again, she was trying deliberately to build up a repertoire of various styles. This painting is without parallel in her expression, in Russian expression, or anywhere really. It was called the void or emptiness. This was something that later would be reflected, say, in Malevich's black square. It's an image of nothingness. This shape, which is so not sharply defined, it looks, it appears to be breathing, and it's leading in. Well, the white is just the primed canvas. It's not a white paint. So another allusion to this nothingness. This was Goncharova's experimentation with non-figurative expression, because what we saw before was, of course, a departure from the traditional aesthetic. There was no traditional perspective, and we saw the essentially graphic arts and diverse range of graphic arts with flatness and the broad, not primitive, but primary colors. It was still figurative. And this was her experimentation, interpretation of non-figurative art, and a meditation on void and emptiness and nothingness. She did not develop it later. The non-figurative was taken over by Rayonism, and that was an aesthetic that was invented by Larionov. But it was a very interesting reflection on the subject, very interesting meditation of what nothingness held. And this is the rayonism, which I mentioned a moment ago, the yellow and green forest rayonist landscape. Rayonism, according to Larionov, was the following. So the objects that we see are really a representation of light reflected off the objects. And then this reflected light will intersect in the space. And what we see in this is this intersection and intertwining of reflected lights, light reflected off surfaces, which forms new shapes. And Natalia Goncharova embraced this aesthetic. They generally always worked together. And when, well, if an exhibition was organized by Larionov, the major body of that work will be by Goncharova. And of course, by others as well. But yet again, she became a very familiar face in the landscape of avant-garde, and a familiar name, almost a household name. And in 1907, Natalia, when we spoke earlier about these two major exhibitions, the 1913 one in Moscow was enthusiastically praised by Alexander Benoit, among others, and he was a major art critic and a long-standing collaborator on Diaghilev's art projects, including the Ballet Russe. It was on Benoit's recommendation that Diaghilev, the same year, traveled to Moscow from Paris to meet Goncharova and invite her to create stage designs and costumes for his production of the Golden Cockerel, frequently referred to by its French name, Le Coq d'Or, to premiere in 1914 in Paris. The libretto, written by Vladimir Belsky, derived from Alexander Pushkin's 1834 poem, The Tale of Golden Cockerel. It is really fascinating to see how Pushkin is a leitmotif in Natalia Goncharova's life. She didn't seek to illustrate Alexander Pushkin's production, and yet somehow Alexander Pushkin found her via the immediacy of Diaghilev and his ballets. She agreed, and as a matter of fact, at the time she was absolutely inundated with commissions. It was absolutely, well, it was a very successful exhibition in Moscow, not so in St. Petersburg. Because interestingly, at the time, St. Petersburg was extremely conservative, and this avant-garde expression was absolutely not accepted there, which is why, yet again, Moscow was both the hub and the melting pot of these various manifestations of new artistic styles, and a home to everyone who sought to try and express themselves in a new way. So Le Coq d'Or, opera by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. We are saying opera because originally it was an opera, indeed by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, and the last one he composed before his death. But with Diaghilev, it became a combination. It was an opera ballet. And the first performance was on the 24th of May, 1914, and the stage designs and costumes were by Natalia Goncharova. Choreography was by Michel Fouquet. Michel Fouquet was originally a little bit apprehensive of meeting Goncharova, but then he was completely swayed by her. And in his memoirs, he was writing that she struck him as serious and reserved, as a Byzantine icon. He was not the only person comparing Goncharova to a Byzantine icon. And she was very quiet in her life, in real life. She was not a person of many words, and very serious in everything she uttered. And ahead of the premiere, Diaghilev organized an exhibition of Natalia Goncharova and Larionov's art at the Galerie Paul Guillaume in Paris, which was enthusiastically received and critiqued in the most complimentary way. And of course, also there was something to prepare the public for the forthcoming production of Le Coq d'Or, And here we see possibly all the confluence and the fusion of all the various aesthetics and influences that we discussed before. The folk expression and some of the cubism possibly, and the Scythian ladies, and some of Picasso's cubism, and the wild colors of the Fauvism, but also of the native peasants. And in fact, in the monograph that was published after the exhibition of 1913, she declared her new creed, that she had studied everything that Western art, contemporary Western art, had to offer. And she's grateful to it because it opened her eyes to her own native art. And so now she is going back to the East. And the East was also interpreted broadly. It was not only Russia, although Russia, of course, as well, but Egypt, Greece, Coptic art, Africa. Africa as well was included in this broadly conceived Orientalism. A cubist curtain designed by Natalia Goncharova for the third act of the 1913 Ballet Russe, Ballet Le Coq d'Or. And here again is a combination of a cubism art and of the primitive art. It could be almost a quest, trying to find, to see how many reindeer, for instance, we can find. And there is one in the top left-hand corner, then almost symmetrically across the curtain design on the right, and then a couple of others. And the same is true about the human figures. If one looks closely, there are a number of them. And also, it's interesting how she renders the antlers of this reindeer as trees, and in an evocation of this neo-primitive worldview of paleo cultures, these collective paleo cultures on which she continued to draw, and some homes, houses and dwellings and fences, and the border evoking some floral designs. This was another scent design, which was subsequently used as a prototype for stage designs for another ballet on a Russian theme, which was called The Wedding, which premiered in Paris in 1923, although subsequently it was performed elsewhere, including London. We are still discussing the Coq d'Or, but it's important to see it as an inspiration for a whole array of other productions with Diaghilev ballets. And this is something that can be brought to bear on transnational and transatlantic aesthetics and sensibilities, because Diaghilev's ballets, and particularly this one, went on tour to America in the same year. And it was an absolutely resounding success in Paris. This ballet made her famous in France as well as Russia. And also, like I said, when the season was over in Paris, Diaghilev's troupe crossed the Atlantic to tour America, and it was a huge success there as well. And this is how you can be trying to justify the title of Natalia Goncharova being the firebird of Russian avant-garde. She took this expression of this particular style of Russian avant-garde from Russia to Europe and from Europe to the States, and made it known there and accepted and an inspiration. As we know, after 1917, many Russian artists, and particularly of the avant-garde expression, immigrated first to Europe and then to the States, and informed that expression across the Atlantic. So a wedding usually implies a feast and a celebration, or a reception, as one would say. So in the center of this piece, we see a table and plates laid out for the wedding celebration. And here Well, another set designed by Natalia Goncharova for ballet russe Le Coq d'Or, and we see how fluidly she moves between, if we go one back, say this kind of cubist, futurist, graphic styles, and say folk motifs and floral design, textile decorations, and again how she makes them her own. And how she very well, yes, I'm repeating myself, but how very fluidly she was drawing upon that repertoire that in her previous years of her very active amassing these various expressions, how she draws upon her now to create these stage designs and to create her own vision. Costume designs for a peasant woman, and in the piece on the left-hand side is signed in the upper right. I would very much like at this moment to draw our attention to the size of the hands of these ladies. We had seen previously, although I did not draw our attention to them at the time, that the hands are very much out of proportion. And well, she experiments, of course, with scales. It was never meant to be a naturalist presentation, but the size of the hands was always a symbolist utterance, both in the ecclesiastical expression, when the Mother of God is normally portrayed with somewhat larger arms, the hands, because the hands also serve as a seating, as a throne for the Christ child. She also embraced the same interpretation in her pieces when she was working with peasant ladies, because there that was an instrument of the toil and work of with which these ladies cultivated the land, and land is also is a mother and Mother Earth. Here she also embraces and pursues the same aesthetic, and later we shall see the motive of hands in particular in her other ballet on a religious subject. However, here we now are relishing in this folk designs and the shawls which I mentioned earlier. And this is a comment. We noticed, we mentioned another ballet, The Wedding, that premiered in Paris and later came to London. And these two ballets, in their intrinsic ethics, are very close, they're very connected. So these comments were on The Wedding, but in equal measure, they can be used to describe the public's reaction to the ballet, the Coq d'Or. I do not know of any other ballet so interesting, so amusing, so fresh, or nearly so exciting as The Wedding. The ballet is a rendering in sound and vision of a peasant soul in its gravity, in its deliberate and simple-minded intricacy, in its subtly varied rhythms and deep undercurrents of excitement that will astonish and delight every intelligent man and woman who goes to see it. That was a gentleman who went to see it in London and who left his reminiscences in his work on Stravinsky. And another quotations is from a Harvard Art Review and their exhibition held in 2003, Le Coq d'Or, Natalia Goncharova's designs for the ballet russe. Goncharova's fresh approach to popular Russian art, her familiarity with contemporary French painting, and not least, her sense of humor, qualified the artist to become a mediator between the Russian avant-garde and the West. This is another painting, somewhat slightly different. It's not a painting, it's a graphic design, it's a sketch, and choreography yet again by Michael Pushkin. It is signed, and yet another, and this is a costume designed for a boyar or boyarin. She was very fond and also studied profoundly Russian fabrics, and we shall need to mention the fabrics, historic vestments, when we are going to be discussing the ballet, which I also have mentioned in passing, the liturgy, because in the same year, 1913, that saw her own major exhibition, in Moscow there was another exhibition held of Russian ancient art, which featured both icons and ecclesiastical various art forms and vestments. And there was a whole section dedicated to religious vestments. And we shall see more of what possibly inspired Natalia Goncharova from that exhibition, which she of course saw as well. 1913 also saw an exhibition of icons in Moscow from one of the illustrious collections of one of the Russian collectors of Russian art. And the same year, 1913, saw an exhibition of Lubok. So somehow all these definitive trends, artistic trends, and then inspirations came together also in the artistic life of Moscow in 1913, as they did in Goncharova's expression. More designs, and here it is fascinating to observe a completely different Natalia Goncharova, because these are designs for the Queen of Shemaha in the ballet Russe. And this is Orientalism at its utmost. And the public were probably not deeply interested in the kind of intellectual and cultural processes in Russia out of which the ballet was born, but was attracted to the exoticism, Orientalism, and their rich visuals. And the visuals were provided by Goncharova. Yet again, this was a runaway success. He woke up famous and a celebrity, and if before she was famous only in Russia, now she was famous in France as well, and there were also various commissions. But she returned to Moscow after this premiere. Diaghilev ballets traveled further on to tour his ballets in America, and Goncharova and Larionov went back to Moscow. Of course, 1914 was a tragic year for Europe, because this was when the First World War broke out, and Natalia Goncharova's response was the issuing of a graphic series of the mystic images of the war. We mentioned earlier that she was quite religious, and religious expression was one of the major inspirations. And this was a series of black and white prints, and this particular, there were 12 of them, and these two are a city that has been doomed, and angels and aeroplanes. It is an echo and again a conversation of an earlier series, The Harvest, where she explored the theme of the apocalypse, of which we saw one piece somewhat more festive, the Phoenix of resurrection. But one of the series then, one of the paintings in the series then, was angels casting stones on the doomed city. And this is a theme she revisits now, when there is an actual war. And another city that has been doomed, but now in a very black and white style and black and white aesthetics and burning city. And these are two other pieces from that series. One to the left is a vision or an apparition, and one to the right is Christ loving warriors. Well, most certainly that was a prayer for a happy outcome. Well, happy outcome, well, yes, it's the war, and I shall possibly not deliberate on this anymore. But it was also a prayer for the divine intercession that also drew on the historical tradition of the icons of the Mother of God being prayed to in times of sieges in the Middle Ages. And that was another conversation with Russia's medieval past, and another testimony to Natalia Goncharova's own sensibilities and her response to the war. In 1915, Diaghilev and his troupe, who were resident in Europe, contacted Natalia Goncharova and invited her to work on the ballet which I mentioned in passing now, which was called the Liturgy. And Natalia Goncharova and Larionov accepted and traveled, and here they are photographed in Switzerland in the illustrious company of Massin, Leonid Massin, behind Goncharova, and Stravinsky, Larionov standing behind Stravinsky, and Leo Bakst, a long-standing collaborator of Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. And this is the ballet. It is very complex. And to explain it all, we shall simply not have the time now. And it was not realized, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons. It was very new. And then Stravinsky, who was commissioned the music, thought it was sacrilegious to dance liturgy. It's one thing to have a spiritual ballet, but not liturgy as such. And and of course there was, well, the war, but the period of preparations left a very deep mark in the heart and soul of everyone involved. Natalia Goncharova was hoping, of course, well, she never planned to stay, leave alone stay indefinitely, because in the end she never returned to Moscow. It was meant to be a very brief stay, and in her home in Moscow she left unfinished sketches and drawings on her table. But she brought with her various books on icons, on Byzantine icons, Russian icons, Italian icons, mosaics, to help her work on this ballet. And while they worked, this troupe, the choreographer, and Diaghilev and Larionov and Goncharova, they traveled both in Spain and Italy to look for prototypes, to help them create the imagery and evocation of the spirit of liturgy in the ballet. It was an enactment of the collective historical consciousness, indeed. It was deeply profound and deeply spiritual, even though when we look at the actual designs, it will be difficult to imagine that this could be born out of this is international religious expression. So one of the iconographic influences was a church of John the Forerunner in Yaroslavl region, this particular arcade, because this is not a typical shape for an iconostasis in Russia, but it's typical in Italy. We shall talk about some other iconographic sources later, but the stage set and costumes were intended to evoke a traditional aesthetic of religious art. Therefore, the costumes proved to be a visual quotation of the sources. Further, they took the form of actual constructions to be carried on the shoulders of the dancers, limiting their movements, thereby requiring a new choreography and making the ballet the first constructivist ballet. There were openings, apertures in the designs that were supposed to be carried for the hands and for the feet. And here we go back to when we mentioned the special role of the hands and their prominence in this expression. So it is essentially, the artists could not move very much except for the movement of the arms and hands, and of course their feet and their legs. And so this aperture is very apparent, and the hands appear to be separate from the design. Sorry, the choreographer was, and Larionov herself, Goncharova herself, were very deeply influenced, particularly by early Italian expression that was called Italian primitive, but well, not because they were primitive, but it's an art historical term. And to the right, we see the Bonaventure Berlinghieri, Saint Francis of Assisi. The altarpiece is painted in tempera on wood and in the Maniera Greca style, And yet again, we look at these arms. It's a very important image from the point of view of the aesthetic of the ballet, because the choreography again was limited to what expression can be derived out of the movements of the hands. And here we see, well, this was a sketch for the Virgin. The Virgin, they thought she would not be danced. It would be only a model that would be carried out onto the stage. And another iconographical influences were the Russian icons, and also, again, the early Italian artists, Santa Trinita Maesta. And it was particularly the choreography again. And as he was in charge of choreography, he was the one who was dictating very much both the aesthetic of the costumes, but also Natalia Goncharova, as the creator of these costumes, found herself in the role of the choreographer, trying to explain to the artists how to actually move in these very pivoting constructivist costumes. Another inspiration was Ravenna, with her, it's 6th century mosaics, Byzantine expression. Of course, Ravenna is Italy, but the frescoes are Byzantine. And again, it was particularly the choreographer, Leonid Messin, was particularly impressed by this. And Goncharova didn't need persuading. And if we look at this image of mosaic of the Magi from Ravenna, and at some of the examples from Natalia Goncharova's work for the ballet, this is one of the Magi. And this was a person who was supposed to represent one of the crowd that went to meet Christ. And yet again, we see these very prominent hands, and they were prominent both from before and due to the apertures in the costumes which the dancers were supposed to wear. And if we look at this apostle to the right, I shall allow myself to use a slide, well, gratefully allow myself to use the slide from a lecture by Galina Serova, who is a scholar from the State Tretyakov Gallery. And it was she who mentioned this exhibition of old Russian, ancient Russian art that took place in Moscow in 1917. And this was where Natalia Goncharova may have seen some of the designs for traditional, historic, medieval, ecclesiastical vestments, and probably employed them here, although of course her frame of reference was diverse, and these motifs could have been derived from elsewhere. And as we said, Goncharova was finding herself giving instructions which concerned choreography, despite not considering herself in any way a choreographer. And let me mention once again, this was the first constructivist ballet. It was not realized, but it had an influence on artists subsequently. These are two more designs for Saint John and a shepherd. The blue background was largely traditional for Russian pictorial expression. Frequently, that was the color of the domes of the churches, and also early icons could be painted on against a blue background. And this was, that could be the ultimate costume design for the ballet liturgy. And yet again, it was not realized at the time. And if we look at the symmetry of this hands and the held together and the wings behind the head of the seraph and the halo rendered as if it were a flower, the petals of a flower. But Leonid Messin and everybody else were very deeply influenced. And yet again, this is, let me gratefully acknowledge Galina Serova yet again. It was from her lecture, Leonid Messin, Ballet Nobilissima Visione, which he realized later, at a later stage in his career, And another ballet, Laudes Evangelii, also by Leonid Massin, even later in 1952. And this is how it was described. This is a quote from the Bavarian state opera site. In 1952, Massin realized a long-standing dream, choreographing Christ's Passion as a narration in stylized movement, in the spirit of Byzantine mosaics and Italian primitive painting. It was a work that he had originally choreographed in 1916, Liturgie, for Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, but which was never performed. Set to 13th century Gregorian chants, orchestrated by Valentina Bucci, Laudes Evangelii was performed in European cathedrals, in Nantes, Perugia, and at La Scala in Milan, and hailed as a monumental artistic achievement. The work was also produced for television and aired in Europe and in the United States. Right. That also had a great influence on Picasso, who wanted to work with Ballet Russe, who traveled with the troupe in both in Spain and in Italy, throughout Spain in Italy, when they were preparing for this ballet. And this ballet was realized by Pablo Picasso for Serge Diaghilev's troupe. It was called Parade and premiered in 1917 in Théâtre du Châtelet in Paris. And that was absolutely clearly inspired by the pioneering work by Natalia Goncharova. It also should be mentioned that the Golden Cockerel also inspired a whole string of productions in the same style, and yet again popularized both Russian aesthetic and themes in Europe and everywhere that Diaghilev's troupe was showing their art and their ballets. But also they inspired fashion and fashion designs, and also helped very much to establish Russian artists of avant-garde persuasion when subsequently they found themselves both in Paris and further afield in the United States. This was a drawing produced by Mikhail Larionov that showed Serge Diaghilev, Igor Stravinsky, Prokofiev, Leonid Massin, and Natalia Goncharova. They became very much a family, or artistic family, and they were spending very much time together, working together. And when 1921 Diaghilev died, it was a major blow. It was a personal blow. Not only was it essentially an end to the classical incarnation of the Ballet Russe, the company that subsequently split into various other fractions of the one-time unique formation, but it was also a deep, deep trauma and a sorrow, both for Diaghilev and for Larionov. Another major series produced at the time when they were collecting material for Liturgie, they traveled again throughout Italy and Spain, was a series, The Spanish Ladies. Goncharova revisited that series throughout her career, and it was also very enthusiastically received. And one of the French critics who wrote an article after an exhibition where these works were shown, he was saying, "Mais c'est la cathédrale. These are cathedrals. These are not ladies." And Tsvetaeva, whom we quoted earlier, who also knew Goncharova and Larionov in Paris, was saying, indeed, everything about this is from a cathedral. These are citadels, citadels of lace. And the fusion, yet again, a decorative composition. These are the Spanish ladies, the folk designs, the cubism, futurism, and everything else that she has once tried to master and learn. More Spanish ladies. She was also a book illustrator, and livres d'artistes were known both, of course, in France And in Moscow, in the early 1910s, she was illustrating books at the time, but this was work for a Parisian publishing house, illustrating the tale about the Tsar Sultan. Another collaboration, one may say, was Pushkin. That was 1921, and 2 years later, 1923, illustration of the tale of Prince Igor, one of the pivotal pieces of Russian medieval literature, one of the rare survivals of medieval literature. So she was truly a very multifaceted artist and one who did embrace a very diverse range of graphic arts and various stylistic expressions. She also created designs for fashion houses, because yet again she helped to introduce and popularize all things Russian in various manifestations. Sketch for a fur-trimmed evening gown, it's 1925. Greenpeace was not at the time to intervene. She worked for luxury fashion houses, and another one, evening dress. And I think that we shall possibly conclude with this period of her art, because she was defined as an artist when she was in Moscow, and it was in Moscow that she helped to define and cement again the very new nascent artistic movement that was still looking for its voice and looking for a definitive form, and she helped to bring it onto the stage. She helped to establish it. She helped to turn the tide of public opinion, and she lent credibility to this entire new language. And also her breakthrough in Europe and in the United States, her collaboration with Diaghilev, and a very mutually fruitful collaboration. And this was possibly when a very good logical point at which to finish our discussion. And we shall only possibly show this image, 1955. This was the year when they got married. Larionov was very unwell, he had a stroke, Goncharova spared neither effort or expense. Long 7 years, she was trying to nurse him back to health. This was a very warm and dignified and effulgent image of these two persons who, once they met, never parted. This was in Paris, their flat in Paris. Very touching image. And to sum up, you can say that this 1950, of course, nobody knows whether it was a wedding gift, but Rayonism was an aesthetic invented by Larionov back in their early days. It was Larionov who was saying that a true artist never rests, and it was bad form to try and continue to sell the one form that an artist once found. One should always be reinventing themselves. But it was his original idea, this Rayonism, and Larionova and Goncharova went back to it, returned to it in the year in which they were married. And this bright yellow color, one that she loved the most. If we look back again and remember her portrait with yellow lilies. And it is true to say that Natalia Goncharova forged her own groundbreaking style based on tradition and innovation. She was a conduit of Russian avant-garde to the West. She influenced the development of performing arts in the 20th century. And in 2008, Goncharova's painting Les Fleurs, painted approximately in 1219, sold at Christie's for this enormous amount of money, setting a then world record among women artists. Thank you very much for your attention, and until now try and stop this recording.